Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 31 in the ongoing series. In this episode, we're going to look at the dramatization of the Lifetime movie, which came out in 2016 on the 20-year anniversary of JonBenet's death. And what is very interesting is the approach that the Lifetime movie took. So, look, Lifetime movies suck, especially when it comes to true crime. You know, whether it's Jodi Arias or the Chris Watts case, you can't expect a high level of accuracy. They're superficial, they sugarcoat the dark underbelly of high-profile cases, they're grossly inaccurate, which is why the stereotype #Lifetime movie bad exists in the first place. But, I've learned to appreciate them. Reenacting a crime or crime scene tends to draw practical considerations to the surface. And that's something that just sheer analysis, like going through transcripts and doing analysis of semantics and body language, it doesn't quite achieve the practical insights that you get from an actual reenactment. So in today's 31st episode, I'll be highlighting at least 3 major insights provided via the Lifetime movie. Before we get to that, thank you to the about 200 subscribers who've subscribed since the last video. Also, thank you to the approximately 100 people who've signed up to Patreon since the series started. It's good to have you there. And, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. You can click on the blue icon on the bottom right, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So some of you may be aware that I've written over 3 trilogies. So it's basically the Craven Silence trilogy, that's the first series. Then the Day After Christmas trilogy, that's the second. And then the third is Black Star over Bethlehem, that's the third trilogy, and then there's 1 or 2 other narratives in between. One is Second Star, and the final narrative is Christmas Star. Now, you might think that when you write a book that you have all the information sort of at the top of your head, and you certainly do at the time that you're writing it. But as time passes, the memories start to sort of fade a little bit, and it sort of dissolves into a bit of a fuzz. And so sometimes when I come back to a case, for example this case, and I'm trying to remember where I saw certain information, sometimes I just can't remember. And then you sort of go through the usual suspects. You say, well, could it be in the police reports? Could it be in this book or that book or that book? Is it on this site? Is it in that sort of encyclopedia site? Is it here or there? And there was something that I wanted to check, and I wanted to just reinvestigate, and I just couldn't find that information. I just looked everywhere for it. I started doing word searches through my narrative step by step, and I literally was just kind of flawed, like, where the hell did I get this information? And what I'm referring to is there's a moment where Burke Ramsey apparently snapped at someone who was talking to him, where that person took a sip of his soda, and that just has always stuck in my mind, that sort of moment. But I couldn't remember where I'd read it or seen it or heard it or whatever. And as I say, I sort of started going crazy, spending days just trying to find this information. I couldn't find it anywhere. And then I think I eventually stumbled on it in this Lifetime movie. So no matter how much you want to deplore, criticize, and just sort of, give give these movies a bad rap, they do sometimes have something going for them, in the sense that they tend to look at, bear in mind, a movie's got to tell a story in a very limited amount of time, and true crime is very, very detail oriented, and so they've got to kind of touch on the highlights, as it were. And so it was thanks to the Lifetime movie that I actually realized what I was looking for and where I was going to find it. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Before we deal with the Lifetime movie in terms of my analysis, I want to give the floor, as it were, to a CNN review of it from Brian Lowry, and this came out on the 4th of November 2016. I'll put a link in the description. Why I want to do this is I want you to see that this is just basically the general view of a reviewer. So it was someone, tasked with the entertainment section of CNN that made this review. Now, I don't know whether I've got to issue a disclaimer and say, okay, well, CNN is fake news and CNN this and so on. But I'm not saying CNN is fake news. I'm just saying, I suppose some people are going to say, because it's from CNN, the review is false. So I'm not quite sure what to do about that, but let's see how it goes. As I said, I'll put a link to the review there. So the review is not crazy about the film. Not too many Lifetime movies, I think, are particularly well reviewed. I know the Chris Watts Lifetime movie was sort of derided, but that also had some interesting ideas in it. Some people thought that the Lifetime movie was going to blame Thrive, which they sort of changed to Strive, and that wasn't really the case. Some people thought that Nicole Kessinger wasn't dealt with enough in the Lifetime movie. I don't even think she was given that name in the movie, and then there was also no reference at all to Anadarko. So the other thing that I think you've got to acknowledge is when you make a movie about a crime, you've got to be aware of legal red tape, and that is what makes this particular Lifetime movie quite perhaps courageous, perhaps quite unusual. I'm not really going to go through the criticisms too much. Brian Lowry talks about the narrative leaving a bad, sleazy taste, and in other words, he's just sort of going through the same hashtag Lifetime movie bad stuff, that this feels smarmy and that wasn't done well and this and that and the next thing. I don't think that's really something that we should focus on. That should be almost like non-negotiable. Obviously, it's not going to be this brilliant, depiction. What we do want to look at is the basic thrust of the story. Which way is it going? What is it trying to say? And so, what is interesting is that, and this is quoting from the article, that first of all, that it's told from the perspective of the detective assigned the case, Steve Thomas. So that's already giving you an idea of the leaning. So it's coming from almost a law enforcement perspective, which is quite different or quite unique given the slew of JonBenet Ramsey content that is out there. Most of the JonBenet Ramsey documentaries, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, tend to be apologia. They tend to be productions featuring the Ramseys, supporting the Ramseys' story, perpetuating the whole intruder narrative, right? And so this is what makes the Lifetime movie quite different. It doesn't take that stand. And so it is taking the Steve Thomas narrative, which obviously the makers of the film thought was authoritative at the time. And I'd certainly think that it was somewhat authoritative. I wouldn't say the Steve Thomas account is the best version of probably what happened. But I think it's better than the Intruder story, personally. So the movie Who Killed JonBenet, this is quoting from CNN Entertainment, reaches a conclusion similar to CBS's recent sleuthing, namely that the 6-year-old was somehow killed in her Colorado home, possibly by her older brother, and her parents then endeavored to cover it up by faking a kidnapping plot gone wrong. The brother filed a lawsuit against an investigator featured in the CBS presentation and has threatened to sue the network. So this is obviously, end quote, this is obviously what is going on in 2016. So it's also kind of interesting that although a lawsuit was filed against CBS for the case of JonBenet, it didn't file anything against this Lifetime movie. So then the reviewer sort of goes through his sort of gripes with the film, that, this is, not a very well done, this and that is icky, and this, that, and the next thing. And then it sort of comes back to sort of dealing with the actual substance of the film. And I'm just quoting from the article. Brian Lowry writes, quote, "The main takeaway is that the police were blocked from conducting a first-rate investigation, beginning with the contamination of the crime scene, both by the Ramseys and higher-ups, who balked at pressing the family on inconsistencies in their stories." So, just to be kind of clear, the basic theme of the film is to say that the police were hindered from doing a proper investigation because of both the Ramseys and higher-ups, who didn't sort of put up obstacles, right? So yeah, you have a Lifetime movie, and as we know, all sorts of different Lifetime movies take different views of certain crimes, and so the whole idea that the Ramseys today, in 2021, are still saying that the case has been botched because of the Boulder cops, right? That was something that was said as recently as a few days ago. I put that up in a video just a few days ago. But this film is presenting a different story about why the case is still unsolved 24 years later, what went wrong. And if you think about it just in a basic way, were the police blocked from investigating, yes or no? Were the police hindered in any way, yes or no? Did the police have a difficult time doing what they wanted to do, yes or no? And you can kind of see all along that the police were frustrated. They were frustrated that they couldn't do what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it, or how they wanted to do it. And that is a narrative on its own, that the police were struggling to do their work. And there are all these other narratives, that this particular person, Linda Arendt, XYZ, the crime scene was contaminated, this, that, and the next thing. But you can't get away from the fact that it was also not, the police weren't facilitated in their efforts. They were frustrated in their efforts. Why do you think that is? Why frustrate the police in doing their jobs? Why was this happening? Who was behind it? What was the point of that? So I think if you're going to repeat the cliche that the Boulder police botched this investigation, it shows that you have a shallow understanding of this case and this Lifetime movie. You might say, oh, well, that's just another example of it being Lifetime movie bad. But it is taking the voice of Steve Thomas and it is dramatizing what he was finding in terms of this. And so from now, we're going to deal with moments in the actual film.
Pray the Lord my soul today. That's the last thing I remember, saying those words. Then I fell asleep. I don't remember anything after that.
So I personally find the opening montage quite powerful. I don't find the first couple of images, which are sort of fictional children doing their thing. It's sort of interspersed with actual pageant footage of JonBenet. But what I do find quite powerful, because I sort of identify with that myself, is these collages sort of gravitate eventually to a man, and the man is looking at a pinboard that is just filled with evidence photos and notes, and when it sort of pans backwards, you see this office that is just packed full of files and photos and documents. And this person is silently looking at all of this, and he is obviously working to, how can I put it, to right a wrong, but also for justice for JonBenet. He's working on behalf of a little girl that he's never met, but that his heart sort of goes out to, and is faced with this mountain, this sort of almost this cavernous, it's almost like if you imagine a room that is wall to wall with post-its, and you're sort of drowning in information. And I've often felt that way about the Ramsey case. And I think if you want to frustrate even an author or an investigator into getting to the meat and potatoes, getting to the core of a case, just create walls and walls of misdirection. And it does then feel like, you've got to go through all the counter narratives and all the misdirection and all the fake suspects and all of that stuff to get to what is lying behind it. And it's exhausting. And you do actually feel like you're drowning in information. And in other words, the case doesn't get smaller, it seems to expand. And you've got to wonder why that is happening. Is it deliberate or accidental? So when you see this man he's sitting in his office and he's just looking at the evidence pinned to the wall in front of him, he's surrounded by files, you kind of get a personal sense of a quiet moment in one of the investigators' lives. Bear in mind, this case probably changed a lot of lives permanently. Some people lost their jobs, some people lost their livelihoods, some people had their reputations ruined, some people were sued, some people just were never the same after this. It was something that made a big difference, often for the worse. Life went downhill after this case. And you can just think about it in another way, is that if the investigation succeeded, some investigators would have been regarded as heroes, regarded as almost like celebrity detectives. Instead, there's almost like an atmosphere of disgrace and failure. And I don't know if that's fair. That it's their fault that this case wasn't solved. So I'm not going to nitpick through the problems with the Lifetime movie. I more want to focus on the aspects that they highlight that are, as far as I'm concerned, either interesting or that they resonate with what I know or what I've researched. It does start off at 5:52 a.m. with Patsy's 911 call. It's not actually the call, it's an actor dramatizing the call. It doesn't quite sound as hysterical as Patsy sounded or as out of breath. And also the woman on the other end, I think her surname was Archuleta. She, in the Lifetime movie, she's depicted by an African American, and of course she wasn't African American. Not that that's a big deal, but it's just, something that is not consistent. But as soon as you change some of the obvious things, it does get you thinking. It gets you thinking, what's not right about this? And that is, I think, quite useful. Even if it's incorrect, it's useful to think, why is it not correct? And what should be done here? So from the 911 call, the film then jumps 30 hours into the future, which as far as I'm concerned, is a massive mistake. Or, I mean, it's obviously their prerogative to do it the way that they want to, but you're missing the most crucial aspect. And obviously, I think they do deal with it in hindsight afterwards. But just to illustrate to what extent this is from a law enforcement perspective, it jumps from the 911 call to 30 hours later, and then Steve Thomas is introduced. You're taken from the 911 call to the police station, and there is Steve Thomas. So it is very much from this law enforcement perspective. Does that make sense? So the first words Steve Thomas, who's acted by somebody else, says in this dramatization is, you're going to cut this meth-headed deal. So Steve Thomas has been pursuing bad guys, and the next thing, an actor representing Pete Hofstrom, who was basically the district attorney, Alex Hunter's right-hand guy, especially on the JonBenet Ramsey case. He enters the office, and Steve Thomas kind of pursues him, disgruntled. He's sort of, are you going to cut this guy a deal? And so that is kind of the culture that was kind of going on, is that the cops go after bad guys and the prosecutors cut deals. And then Steve Thomas's sort of last words as the prosecutor sort of descends the stairs, he sort of shouts after him, "Do you guys prosecute anybody?" And of course, this is the introduction to the JonBenet Ramsey case. And isn't that kind of a question that's been floating in the ether ever since 1996? So in the first 3.5 minutes, essentially, the movie dramatizes already a argument between, I think it's the chief of police and Hofstrom, and they're sort of arguing about what to do with JonBenet's body. And Hofstrom wants them to just let the body go, the autopsy's done, release the body, and they're saying, well, it's actually, we need more time. There's something, they need to sort of study the injuries to JonBenet kind of in more detail. And bear in mind, what eventually happened was there was talk of exhuming the body. So that definitely was in play. The other thing that I think is important to remember, and this is highlighted in the Bardak report, which I spoke about yesterday in episode 30, was that she described the coroner's report as sketchy. And I agree with that. There's no talk about time of death. I don't think that was very easy to talk about or to assess, but of course the coroner arrived at about 8 o'clock that evening, if not later. And it could actually even be 10 o'clock. I'm not quite sure, but it was many, many hours. Remember, JonBenet's body was found at 1 o'clock, so 1,300 hours. I seem to remember that the coroner arrived something like 7 hours later. I think he left at 10 o'clock, something like that. I don't have that information in front of me, but the point is, because he arrived so late, establishing things like time of death wasn't easy for him to do. And other things like, the stomach contents, the pineapple would have partially or would have digested even longer. You have digestion that takes place post-mortem. And so more food would have been, if the autopsy had been undertaken earlier, let's say that very night, I don't know if that would even have been possible, but there's a possibility you would have been able to find more of what was in JonBenet's stomach contents. So besides that, there was also kind of a confusion between what actually killed JonBenet. Was she killed by the blow to the head, or was she killed by the garrote? And then just in a basic way, things like the garrote, DNA on the garrote wasn't ever tested, which seems silly, doesn't it? I mean, this is the murder weapon, and why wouldn't you test that for DNA, for the murderer's DNA? Anyway, in the Lifetime depiction, it sort of deals with the Hofstrom already sort of reminding the chief of police how important the Ramseys are, and like, don't give them a hard time, let them have their way, kind of thing. And this is all established within the first 3.5 minutes. So I see we're at the 25-minute mark. I'm just going to bring up the first thing that I want to highlight in this, and it's basically the moment where the child psychologist just kind of incidentally takes a sip of Burke's soda, and Burke then reacts. He's really upset, and he kind of snaps at her. In the dramatization, he says, okay, I want my own soda now. And in other words, because you've taken a sip of it, because your saliva's on the can. He doesn't say this, but you can kind of imagine that that's what he's thinking. You've now kind of contaminated, spoiled my soda experience. I want a brand new can, right? I want my own can, kind of thing. And as I mentioned earlier, when I saw this in a Lifetime movie, I remembered, so it was actually Dr. Suzanne Bernard. That was where it happened. And I had kind of assumed that it was Dan Schuler who did that, just because you see a can obviously in the video. And we're going to deal with that video in the next episode in the series. Burke's second interview with Dan Schuler. So for those folks on YouTube, if you want to join Patreon to listen to the second half of this episode, head to patreon.com/TCRS and sign up to the $2 tier. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
What? What do you mean the scene wasn't preserved?
It just wasn't, all right?
Linda, what went on in that house?